Hey guys, what's going on? So, this week is tackling one of those buzz terms that I've been talking about, polarization. You hear it in the news all the time. What does it mean? Is it happening in this country? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? I definitely want you guys to leave this class with knowledge that will help you, in your future endeavors, whatever that may be. And that definitely includes understanding what's going on, at the base level of what people say is splitting this country apart, right? I think that's super important. So definitely watch this lecture. If you can't watch the lecture, read the slides. They're pretty straightforward. I think you can get it. Make sure you do the readings. But overall, I think you guys will appreciate this lecture. So let's get right into it. Defining terms. What is political participation? I'm sorry, political polarization. So standard definition you find in the dictionary: the divergence of political attitudes to ideological extremes. I don't love this definition because I don't think it always has to do with ideology, right? You can have polarization based on race and ideas that are not necessarily ideological, like patriarchy and stuff like this. So I don't like the term ideological extreme. So I prefer this definition: the simultaneous presence of opposing or conflicting principles, tendencies, or points of views, right? That just means that you're going to have different points of views. I think that's a key thing. It's a point of view that kind of encompasses everything, right? And they're opposing and they can exist at the same time, which I find is, if anyone's taken my classes before or will in the future, I like these broad definitions. I don't really like putting us in this very narrow kind of definition, and that kind of restricts of what we're talking about, right? This kind of encompasses almost everything. So I don't want to read this whole quote, but I'm just going to give you the specifics. So pretty much what this is saying is that almost 4 in 10, 38% politically engaged Democrats are consistent liberals, up from just 8% in 1994. The change among Republicans, less dramatic. However, it's gone from 33 consistently conservative up from 23% in 1994. So both have gone to one side or the other, right? So then this is the most recent Gallup survey, which always has good data. So right off the top of my head, if I just read this quote, I'd be like, oh, of course, there's more polarization in this country. That's the only way that this could be explained. However, before we jump to that conclusion, it's always good to look at the whole picture, right? And at the end of the day, I want you guys to come to your own conclusions. But with some of the stuff that I'm going to explain, I think it shows that political polarization doesn't really have a dramatic effect in this country like the news makes it out to be, right? Oh my God, I'm in these group chats and people are like, the country is becoming more and more polarized. But if you, all I'm encouraging is doing a deeper dive. I think that's always important, right? So again, political polarization, pretty much going to one extreme to the other, right? And we see this from these graphs, right? The top graph, liberal versus conservative, right? This is polarized, right? The majority of people, right? If you've ever seen one of these normal distributions, that's from economics, you don't need to know that, is that more people are on the extremes, right? This graph shows this line up here all the way towards the top, more people towards the extremes. And towards the bottom, you have non-polarized, right? Almost everyone is in the middle. Just a small, tiny fraction of these people are actually at the extremes, right? And so obviously this can be a state, like right now, this is a state. There are the extremes, or it could be a process where it changes over time. And usually when we're talking about polarization, we're talking about the change over time, at least in this country. And to show the change over time, I got this amazing little graph. Let's start 1994. I don't even have to say anything. Just take a look at this. And we're going to get all the way to 2014. You can see, just like the quote I said before, people that are consistently liberal and consistently conservative are increasingly moving to the side of Democrat and Republican, right? This graph is pretty crystal clear. And again, it's just like, well, polarization, right? This is what's happening in this country. People are getting more and more to the extreme of another. And I'm going to dispute that in just a second. Here's just another breakdown of that exact same graph, just if you wanted to have this in your notes or something like that. So let's talk about what might cause political polarization, right? People going to these different extremes. Well, obviously, we have old ones, right? Race, they're old, a really old one, first language spoken. Remember, we talked about Teddy Roosevelt and how you have to know English in order to being American, right? Indigenous status, religious affiliation, sex, all these things tend to make people kind of go to one extreme or another in terms of how they vote or who they vote for, right? Another one, which is more modern, I suppose, is this idea of traditionalism versus progressivism. I think this is most apparent in stuff like gender roles and the role of the woman in the workforce and patriarchy and stuff like that. Those traditional family values, right, that is often espoused by conservatives. And then on the progressive side, it's often kind of just said like this is old news, right? So traditionalism versus progressivism, that's kind of another cause for political polarization, or could be a cause for political polarization. Of course, just straight up, like we said before, ideology, right? If you consider yourself a leftist or you consider yourself a straight up conservative, right? Those kind of political views always can lead to polarization. And like we talked about in the electoral college slides, geography and federalism, right? Where you're located, what your kind of status is in society can directly lead to political polarization. Obviously, voting for, we don't have a two-party system, but voting for one end or the other. So these are just some, quick rundown causes of political polarization, just kind of the basic ones. And, I should really add right here, economic status. However, this is a little, because you have poor people and that vote for Republican, you have poor people that vote for Democrat. So although economic status you think might be an indicator, it's less so. But I'm going to put that in there just in case. So we looked at people becoming more and more liberal, more and more or more and more liberal, more and more conservative, and they're kind of shifting these party lines. And so that looks like polarization, right? It looks like people are becoming more and more extreme. But if we look at this from a slightly different perspective, right? This is from National Election Studies. This is like, where every political science gets their data from, right? Has people's ideology changed from 1972 to 2004? So almost 30 years, right? And if you look at the graphs, right, the gray and the black line, they're almost exactly the same. A little dips here and there, but for the most part, the people in the middle, right, moderate, middle of the road, which is usually a good chunk of the country. In this case, it says 30%, but I would say maybe even a little bit higher. Well, obviously, it's replaced by or augmented by don't know, haven't thought, which usually means middle of the road. So obviously, it's almost the majority of the country that is middle of the road or they don't know. And it hasn't changed in 30 years. It hasn't changed in 30 years. So how are we getting this split between the two parties? I'll keep going. Also, here's another thing. Just a very similar graph explaining the same thing. Do people know their ideology? And I think this is changing over the past 20 years. Now it's 2020, and they did this in the 2000s. I think people maybe are more aware of their ideology. This gray line up to the top is people that say, that are moderate, right? Moderate people at 40. So that makes total sense. Sorry, I thought this was the I don't know. The I don't know, where is it? Oh, it's pretty low. Yeah, okay, so I feel like that's about right. Yeah, I feel like people tend to kind of have some idea of what political party, but not always, right? But like we said before, people that consider themselves moderate were just at 40%. That makes total sense, right? A lot of people do consider themselves moderate and don't want extreme views. So do people know their ideology? For the most part, yeah. So if people know their ideology, and people know, and now from this graph that we know that people haven't really changed over, from 30 years, from 1972 to 2004, right? How are we going to explain this? All right, I'm going to get there. But first, we have to explain what the Southern realignment is, right? So, yes, positions have moved across the nation as a whole, but not in a polarizing manner. This is the Southern realignment. I'll read you this quote from the article that I signed to you. I know this article, it's a real political science article with real statistics. Like someone actually did research on this. It's not a typical, New York Times or whatever article that I usually give. So I understand this might be a little harder, but do your best you can. It says, rather, we see a largely centrist public drifting slightly rightward on some issues, slightly leftward on others, but only very small declines, 2 to 5 percentage points in the total number of moderates, right? So something here is going on. And this comes down to something called, well, actually, I want to get back to this in one sec. This comes down to something called polarization versus realignment, otherwise known as party sorting, right? So if people say they haven't changed, right, and people know what their ideology is, and we're just going to assume that's been the case up until this point, how do we explain the fact that those graphs show that people are going to one side in these different parties, right? Well, let me show you the difference between polarization and realignment. Let's assume that the total amount of marbles in this big jar and then these three little jars are the same, right? Big jar has we just poured these 3 little jars into this big jar. When we sort these marbles, has anything really been polarized? And let's assume, obviously, that the blue is the Democrat, the red is the Republicans, and we'll call the green, undecided, right? Because there's a good chunk of undecided people in this country in terms of their party choice, right? Is this polarization? By our definition, no, because nothing is really being pulled to the extreme. We're not losing any green marbles, right? We're not gaining red marbles. We're not gaining blue marbles. We are just sorting them into their proper space, right? And this kind of can give the illusion of polarization. If we go back to these graphs over here, this isn't people all of a sudden saying, oh, I'm a hardcore leftist or I'm a hardcore conservative. These are people saying, oh, the Democrats align more with my values, so I'm going to vote more Democrat. And these are the people saying, oh, the Republicans align more with the Republican, align with more ideas, my ideas, and so I'm going to vote Republican. So it's not actually based on the data that we have and based on this graph, although some of it might be a little political polarization. A lot of this is what's called party sorting, right? People figuring out that this group identifies with me and has my interest in mind. This group identifies with me, has my interest in mind. I'm going to vote this way. I'm going to vote that way. So people that were consistently liberal, they might have voted Republican, Democrat back and forth sometimes. Now they're just voting always Democrat, and the same for Republicans, right? And so when you look at this graph, it looks like polarization, but if we look at the other information, it's really not. It's people just figuring out what party they belong to. This brings up the question, why are people figuring out what party they belong to after all this time, right? Hopefully you guys read the Southern Realignment article, but I'm going to go over it with you quickly, because I know this lecture is already getting pretty long. And I don't want this one to be boring because I think this is super, super important, right? But let's get into it. I'm going to skip this slide for now. Is this polarization, party sorting, a new trend? And we have to ask this question because it's come up. Everyone says polarization. It's tearing apart this country. Well, is it a new thing, right? And then a close election, right? Right down to the couple of 100,000s of votes, right? That implies that the country is split and that there's high levels of polarization, right? So what is the closest election in the past 100 years, right? Well, it's actually Nixon versus Kennedy. It's not Trump versus Hillary. It's not Bush v. Gore, although Bush v. Gore is close. It's Nixon versus Kennedy. And this would imply that this is the biggest polarization, the biggest cleavages that we've had in this country, right? What was going on during Kennedy's time? I wish that we had in class right now because I would love to talk about this. I would love to see who knows what. But I guess I'll just have to say, it's a civil rights movement, right? So in the past, and this is just kind of for anything, right? If you want to win a popular vote, obviously we have electoral college, but let's just assume popular vote. You want to appeal to the most amount of people, right? And especially if most people, like we saw in those graphs before, always say that they're in the middle of the road, right? You want to have middle of the road policies. And this is actually a huge issue in American politics for the longest time because people pretty much said, I don't know the difference between a Republican and Democrat, right? It's actually a real issue, and it's completely different from what we have now. I say read this on your own time, but I do want to read the bottom quote because it's so good. It says, neither party has any clean-cut principles, any distinctive tenets, right? Any distinctive qualities. The two great parties were like two bottles. Each bore a label denoting the kind of liquor contained, but each was empty. Pretty much saying, you can't tell the difference, and they're both full of hot air, and nothing really mattered, right? Your vote for the Democrat was the exact same thing as a vote for a Republican. And this is obviously different now because we feel this humongous difference between a Democrat and a Republican presidential candidate, senator candidate, and it would be hard-pressed to get someone to switch, right? Even do cross-ballot voting, which is something I'm going to talk about in just a sec. Now, there's always been a little bit of polarization, right? The parties usually kind of latched on to just one thing to argue about, right? Because you got to have at least some facade of a debate, right? In the 1700s, right? This was the Whigs and the Federalists, right? Federal versus state and citizen power. 1850s, Republican versus the Democrats, right? Slavery. 1930s, still Republicans, Democrats. New Deal, social welfare. And then 1960s, civil rights is obviously the big thing that the two parties are debating. And this brings us to the Southern realignment, right? Which is when, let me see, did I get to it right here? Here we go. Sorry, my slides are all messed up. Pretty much the splintering of the Democratic Party into the north and the Dixiecrats into the south, right? This is that big, and when people often say, oh, it's the Democrats that erected statues of the Confederates in the South, and that's 100% true, because it is true. The Democrats in the South in the 1800s and early 1900s was the party of slavery. And it wasn't until 1960s when the Democratic leadership started to shift towards civil rights is that we had this big split. And of course, we had Strom Thurmond, Democrat, who ran for Dixiecrat, right? Technically Democrat that ran for president back in the 50s and 60s. So yeah, you have this huge splintering between in the Democratic Party, and the values are starting to switch, right? And there are other reasons for the Southern alignment other than just civil rights, right? Economic growth in the South leads to GOP membership because the GOP claims that they're for the underdog, essentially. Religious regions, the GOP begins to start kind of taking this religious conservative stance, which appeals to a lot of people in the South. And then, of course, I highly recommend everyone doing a deep dive into this. Reagan's Southern strategy, which he essentially used stereotypes and different racial kind of, how do I put it, caricatures in order to kind of gain votes in the South. And pretty much after Reagan, it was pretty much a wrap that the South was solidly Republican. It was around that time. So yes, yeah, I mean, that's the Southern realignment. It's people realizing that, hey, the Democrat Party is no longer accepting my values. The Dixiecrats split off, and then slowly over time, the Republican Party realizes that they can take advantage of this, right? And then begin to absorb the people that no longer feel in place with the Democratic Party, the new Democratic Party, right? And this is what kind of leads us again back into this graph over here, the shifting. Again, it's not people thinking that their ideologies has changed, that they're becoming more and more leftist, or they're becoming more and more conservative or right wing, right? These are people just figuring out, hey, I more belong to the Democrat Party. I'm going to vote Democrat all the time. I belong more to the Republican Party. I'm going to vote Republican all the time. And so these graphs can be misleading. And of course, like I said before, there is definitely a case that there is some polarization going on now. Let me go down to this slide. Social media, which I'm going to have a whole another section on for next week, can definitely cause more cleavages in the United States. And a lot of students are very adamant about this, and I believe it to some extent. Let me see. Increasing campaign costs, attracting the most extreme candidates. That's also a big one. Increased lobbying. Obviously, if candidates are being lobbied by these humongous corporations, that can lead them to be more extreme or more leaning one way versus the average citizen, right? And then this, of course, artificially small political spectrum in the U.S. breaking down. The only really great example of this we have right now is the Red Scare. If you don't know about the Red Scare, it's when they pretty much said, hey, it's illegal to be a leftist or a communist in this country. And then we got rid of all those people, right? Look up McCarthyism if you're not familiar with this, which is essentially why the United States doesn't have a real political left. It's really just, I mean, if you look at Europe, Bernie Sanders would be a centrist, right? But yeah, so I really think this is a super important idea to understand because it comes up all the time. And when you think about it, are people that much different 50, 60, 70 years ago from how we are now? And the answer is, well, at least from the research that I've seen, and again, come to your own conclusions on this. And the answer is, for me, no. People, for the most part, are almost exactly the same. They want the exact same thing. They want, food. They want heat. They want good living conditions, and they generally want, good jobs, stuff like that, right? And so the political spectrum hasn't changed dramatically in terms of people's mind. That might be changing more now, right? Because like I said, a Red Scare that kind of artificially took out this huge chunk of, a political spectrum, right, which might be coming back. So you might be able to call that political polarization, but I really don't even feel that's political polarization because, again, it was artificially taken out. And so the natural regrowth of that doesn't really feel like polarization to me, right? Is there anything else that I missed? I guess I'll just leave it on one last thing on this graph, right? This graph says better in this one image than 1,000 words can, right? You can clearly see the Republican Party gaining all these seats in the South, starting at about 1983, but then the really uptick is during 1991. This is about the time when people, again, civil rights movement right around here, you see this. You feel people gravitating to the Republican Party because they no longer feel that the Democrat Party represents them, right? So in the South, Democrat senators have gone down dramatically, all the way down to 2001. This slight uptick, but from you look at this, from almost zero, like not even 10, all the way up to 80. It's insane, and you can't explain that with polarization. You can only explain that with party sorting, which makes complete total sense with the historical issues going on at that time. All right, I'm going to leave it at that. I realize this is a bit of a complicated topic. If you have any questions, just let me know. I would gladly, I'll gladly talk about this literally all day.